ever start to think about how a single religion could become so dominant across an entire continent?
It's a huge question, isn't it?
It wasn't always peaceful chats and reasoned debate, was it?
Yeah.
Some of the early methods of spreading Christianity in Europe were surprisingly forceful.
Oh, absolutely.
Makes you really consider the complex relationship between faith and power throughout history.
It certainly does. And it raises a fundamental question about how any set of beliefs, especially those with, well, far-reaching implications, manages to gain widespread acceptance and shape societies.
Well, you asked for it, and today on the Deep Dive, we're plunging into the medieval Roman Catholic missionary paradigm. We're going to explore how the church went about spreading its faith across Europe between, let's say, roughly 600 and 1500 AD.
Right.
This is a period that saw a pretty dramatic shift as Europe moved from a patchwork of beliefs to a continent that was, well, undeniably Christian.
Our goal, as always, is to navigate this rich history in a way that's thorough, but also focused. We want to extract the core mechanisms and the key ideas that drove this monumental transformation without getting bogged down in excessive detail.
Exactly. And our main source for this deep dive is 009, the medieval missionary paradigm.pdf, which you shared with us.
That's the one.
This era, the Middle Ages, from around 600 to 1500, was a real pressure cooker of historical forces. You had the influential papacy or Gregory the Great,
Right.
the rise of Islam, the eventual fall of Constantinople, and the very dawn of the Age of Discovery.
A huge span of time, really transformative.
It was a period where Europe's religious map was redrawn on a massive scale.
And what's fascinating to consider is that in the early centuries of Christianity, the intellectual and theological center of gravity was very much in the East. Greek was the language. But over time, a distinct form of Christianity rooted in Latin language and culture began to solidify its hold in the West.
And this wasn't just a change in language, right?
Not at all. It signaled some significant underlying shifts in how faith was understood and practiced.
Which, of course, eventually culminated in the Great Schism of 1054, with a formal split.
Exactly, between the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholic churches.
Our source highlights some of the core theological differences there. The East tended to see salvation as more of a gradual process, like drawing closer to the divine.
Yeah, sort of a lifelong journey of transformation. Theosis, they sometimes call it.
Okay. Whereas the West placed a greater emphasis on sin, the impact of sin, and the need for a more decisive, maybe crisis-oriented experience of redemption.
That's a good way to put it. Redemption through Christ's sacrifice on the cross became very central.
So the East focused more on who Christ was, God becoming human, emphasizing humanity's potential.
Right, the potential to become more like God. The incarnation was key.
And the West emphasized what Christ did on the cross, the gravity of sin, the necessity of atonement.
Precisely. That starological focus, the focus on the cross, became very prominent, and these different theological weights had a real impact on their respective missions, how they approached spreading the faith. But it's also important to remember there was common ground. The Western Church, just like the Eastern, held a deep reverence for visual elements in worship.
Right. Art, architecture.
Exactly. And a strong commitment to articulating their beliefs with precision. Think about the detailed definitions of doctrine from councils like the Fourth Lateran.
Or the First Vatican, much later.
Yeah, it demonstrates that shared intellectual drive to understand and define their faith.
Okay, so to really dig into the roots of this Western approach, we need to look at a figure who lived just before the Middle Ages officially began, but whose influence was absolutely foundational.
Augustine of Hippo.
Augustine, yeah. Born in 354, he's often considered the intellectual architect of Western Christianity.
The one who really set this medieval paradigm in motion.
He lived through incredibly disruptive times, The sack of Rome in 410, that was huge, a massive shock.
Shook the whole Roman world.
Absolutely. And beyond that external crisis, he also faced significant internal debates within the church itself, particularly the challenges from the Donatists and Pelagius. Okay, let's start with Pelagius. His view of human nature was pretty optimistic, wasn't it?
Very much so. He essentially believed humans were born with the ability to choose good, to achieve perfection through their own efforts.
He saw Jesus primarily as a moral example to follow, not necessarily a savior in the same way Augustine did.
That's a key point. Pelagius really stressed human free will, our capacity for righteousness through our own actions, words, and thoughts.
And Augustine, he had a much darker view.
Well, yeah, based on his own experiences and reading Paul's letters, he emphasized original sin. The idea that we inherited this fallen nature from Adam and Eve.
Leaving us inherently flawed, incapable of saving ourselves.
Exactly. For Augustine, human sinfulness was so deep-seated that only God's direct intervention, what he called irresistible grace, through faith in Christ, could bring about salvation.
So this led Augustine to become a central figure in developing the doctrine of justification by faith alone, really leaning into Paul.
Very heavily. The idea that our sinful condition is so profound, only God can initiate salvation. We're helpless without God's grace. No prior merit needed.
Okay.
And Augustine's focus became intensely personal. He grappled with the individual's journey, his confessions, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you.
Right, that famous line.
The emphasis shifted to the salvation of the individual soul, a very intimate, otherworldly concept.
Which was a significant departure from more communal, maybe this worldly focuses.
Definitely. Especially compared to many earlier religious traditions in Europe. Anselm's later work, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Human, also reflects this individualistic focus on redemption.
So this wasn't just about personal piety. It actually laid groundwork for a Western emphasis on the individual.
You could argue that, yeah. It echoes even in modern concepts of rights and freedoms, a stark contrast to more collectivist worldviews of the time.
And this individualization, as our source points out, contributed to a kind of dualistic view of reality in Western Christianity, spiritual versus earthly.
Right, a clearer separation. The hope of heaven became the ultimate reward for enduring the difficulties of this life.
Which fostered practices like self-examination, penance.
Rigorous self-examination, yeah. Penitential acts aimed at personal spiritual purification.
But here's the paradox the source mentions. This inward focus actually opened the door for outward institutional control.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The church increasingly defined what counted as sin.
And positioned itself as the primary way to get forgiveness. Through sacraments.
Exactly. Positioned itself as the guarantor of salvation. Soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, started to become almost distinct from Christology.
The study of Christ.
And increasingly subordinate to ecclesiology, the study of the church itself.
Okay. Now, let's turn to the Donatists. This was a big movement in North Africa.
Yeah, very significant. They challenged the legitimacy of church leaders they thought had compromised during Roman persecutions, called them traitors.
They held a very strict view of the church. Like, it should only be for the truly pure.
Absolutely. They believed the sins of leaders could invalidate their office, even their sacraments.
A really high standard. Separation from the corrupt world.
Definitely. A clear, uncompromising separation. They thought a true church couldn't be tainted by moral failings, especially in leadership.
And Augustine opposed this.
Strongly.
Very strongly. He argued the church wasn't meant to be an exclusive club for the perfect. It was more like a hospital for sinners.
A community existing precisely to minister to a flawed, broken world.
Right. He pointed out, anyone entering the church would inevitably find imperfect people there.
So Augustine's core argument, the church is for the flawed, not just the faultless. But our source also highlights a potentially problematic outcome of his position.
Yeah, the idea that the authority and holiness resided in the institution itself, almost regardless of the moral character of its leaders.
Which led to that powerful phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus.
Outside the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. A statement that carried immense weight for centuries. So this idea of an indelible mark from baptism, it meant even if someone left the church, their baptism still counted. It fundamentally changed their spiritual status in the church's eyes.
Precisely. This idea, it wasn't original to Augustine, Cyprian mentioned it earlier, but it got reinforced powerfully in papal bulls like Unam Sanctum, council pronouncements.
And it has huge implications for mission, right?
Profound implications. Bringing people into the visible structure of the Catholic Church became essential. Absolutely essential for their eternal salvation.
Our source even notes how later popes, Benedict XVI, Pius VII, were concerned about Protestant missions.
Yeah, it underscores that conviction that the Catholic Church held the exclusive path.
And this also influenced the understanding of baptism itself.
It did. The early church often emphasized spiritual transformation, ongoing formation.
Catechesis and all that.
Right. But with this increasing focus on church membership as the prerequisite for salvation, the act of baptism took on more central significance, almost like a guarantee of entry.
Conferring that indelible character, the indelible spiritual mark.
Exactly. A mark that remained even if someone later renounced their faith.
And Augustine applied this logic to the Donatists.
He did. He argued their baptisms were valid because of that character. So they shouldn't be rebaptized, but rather persuaded, even compelled by state power, to return to the Catholic fold.
Compelled, using state authority.
He saw it as just discipline, not persecution, a way to guide them back, prevent their eternal loss.
But he didn't advocate the same for pagans, people who've never been Christian.
No, that was a distinction he made. Thomas Aquinas later refined this, arguing those who never accepted the faith shouldn't be forced, but heretics and apostates who had professed belief could be compelled to uphold their commitments.
This close relationship between church authority and state power seems like a really key theme.
It's central.
Augustine's big work, the Civitate Dei, City of God, written after Rome's sack, that laid the groundwork.
Absolutely. He presented the idea of two cities. The Civitas Dei, City of God, for those loyal to God, and the Civitas Terrena, the earthly city, focused on worldly concerns, coexisting.
So his ideas about salvation and the church set the stage. How did that translate into church-state interactions?
Well, it's vital to understand Augustine didn't initially equate the visible church with the Civitas Dei.
Okay.
But, as our source points out, over the following centuries, those two concepts got increasingly intertwined, almost fused.
So the Roman Catholic Church came to be seen as the earthly manifestation of the city of God.
By many, yes, which led to a significant elevation of the institutional church and papal authority.
And Augustine's view was that the earthly city should be subservient to the city of God, establishing the primacy of spiritual power.
That was the idea. And it profoundly shaped the papacy's influence over secular rulers. Think of Aquinas' synthesis.
Faith above reason, spiritual above earthly.
Right, culminating in Boniface VIII's Unam Sanctum, claiming both temporal and spiritual swords belonged ultimately to the church.
Wow. And the practical result?
The church became highly privileged, deeply interwoven with state structures, throne and altar.
Charlemagne's letter to Pope Leo III in 796 is a good example.
A perfect illustration. Charlemagne saw his role as defending the church, especially against pagans. The Pope's duty was to pray for his military success.
A reciprocal deal. Church legitimizes ruler, ruler protects church.
Pretty much.
And this close alliance blurred the lines between enemies of the church and enemies of the state.
Naturally, Charlemagne even called his subjects fideles Dei et nostri, faithful to God and to us.
So opposing the ruler could be seen as opposing God, justifying action against, say, the Saxons who resisted conversion and his rule.
That was often the logic, yes.
It's easy for us, looking back from our more secular time, to be critical of this church-state entanglement.
Very easy.
But as Leslie Newbegin reminds us in the source, we need to consider the context. Roman Empire collapsed, people sought stability, the church often filled that void, social, political cohesion.
Maybe the choices weren't as simple as they seem now. Should the church have stayed completely out of politics when it was maybe the only stable institution?
It's a tough question. Really makes you think about the dilemmas they face. And this brings us to the, well, sensitive topic of coercion in conversion.
Yeah, definitely sensitive.
Our source details how various methods were used over time. Augustine himself, initially preferring persuasion, eventually accepted things like fines, exile for the Donatists.
Arguing it was for their own eternal good, saving their souls even if it involved pressure.
But doesn't that set a dangerous precedent? Where do you draw the line? What about free will?
That's the crucial question. And history shows attitudes hardening. Gregory the Great went further.
Oh, so?
Suggesting landowners raise rents for unbaptized peasants in Sardinia, incentivizing conversion, even advocating physical punishment for enslaved people refusing baptism.
Using temporal leverage for spiritual ends.
It became more prevalent, and international law started developing in ways that denied non-Christians the same rights until they were baptized. Again, often framed as being for their benefit.
This shift really paved the way for what the source calls indirect missionary war.
Yes. Not necessarily military campaigns solely for forced baptism, but subjugating non-Christian populations militarily, creating an environment where Christian rulers could then promote missionary work under state protection.
And this eventually led even to direct missionary wars.
Right. Though the early church was mostly against Christians fighting. Tertullian, Origen questioned if violence was compatible with Christian faith.
But after Constantine's conversion, especially in the East,
the views started to evolve. Augustine's just war theory provided a framework for limited Christian participation in war. Initially, self-defense, restoring peace, not religious expansion.
But Augustine also introduced the idea of bellum Deo auctor, war sanctioned by God.
He did, suggesting maybe different rules applied if God willed it.
And Gregory the Great took this further, justifying more aggressive military action for expanding Christian influence, at least indirectly.
It seems that way, moving towards justifying aggressive war, facilitating the spread of Christianity in direct missionary war.
So not armies forcing conversion at sword point.
Not primarily. More about conquering territory, establishing Christian rulers, who then create an environment laws, social pressure, incentives that encourages or compels conversion.
Like preparing the soil for the seeds of faith.
You could see it that way.
But the line between indirect and direct missionary war got blurry.
Increasingly blurred in practice, yes. Charlemagne's forced subjugation and conversion of the Saxons is a prime example.
Military defeat followed by compulsory baptism.
With the logic that submitting to the victor's god was expected. Refusing baptism or returning to old beliefs was seen as religious defiance and political disloyalty.
Similar things happened in Norway with Olav Tryggvason and the Wends.
Yes, similar patterns of direct, often violent Christianization occurred in those places too.
But it's important to note, these outright direct missionary wars were relatively uncommon.
They remain the exception. As the source emphasizes, there's a fundamental tension, a contradiction, between warfare's violence and missionary preaching's persuasive message.
Hard to rally an army with a genuine vision of evangelical service.
Pretty much.
And that's why the Crusades, 11th, 13th centuries, aren't best seen as missionary wars.
Right. While definitely full of religious fervor, Pope Urban II's main goal for the First Crusade was responding to Byzantium's call for help against the Seljuk Turks.
And regaining the Holy Land, seen as a threat to Christendom.
Exactly. Not primarily about systematically converting Muslims through military force.
So while direct missionary wars were rare, religiously motivated conflict happened, like the Crusades, but maybe with different primary aims.
That seems a fair summary.
And in this environment, even Augustine's idea that killing in a just war incurred guilt came under pressure.
It did. Some church leaders started suggesting killing pagans, heretics, apostates might even be pleasing to God in certain contexts.
Anselm of Lucca provided theological justification for Gregorian warfare, influencing the First Crusade.
Yes, his ideas were influential there.
So by the High Middle Ages, society was very hierarchical. The church was powerful, influential everywhere.
A dominant force.
And Europe was largely seen as Christian, despite some heretical groups on the fringes. What about Jewish communities?
They occupied a unique, often precarious position, sometimes tolerated based on Augustine and Paul's writings.
Other times persecuted, facing forced conversion.
Unfortunately, yes. Figures like Gregory the Great advocated gentle persuasion for converting Jews, but forced baptisms did happen.
Okay, let's shift focus now. The Age of Discovery, end of the Middle Ages.
A pivotal moment.
For much of the medieval period, Europe was relatively isolated, partly due to Islam's expansion. But then Vasco da Gama, Columbus, end of the 15th century.
Suddenly, new worlds opened up, contact with previously unknown peoples.
And our source connects this directly to medieval teachings on just war and the Church's universal mission, even calling colonization a modern continuation of the Crusades.
It's a strong claim, but the connection is argued. Early Christian colonization within Europe often involved culturally similar groups. Assimilation, conversion through politics and mission.
But the Age of Discovery involved vastly different cultures, languages, beliefs.
Which tragically led to the appalling consequence of racialized slavery on an unprecedented scale.
A sense of assumed Western superiority justifying exploitation.
Deeply ingrained, yes. Providing a distorted justification for enslaving millions of people of color.
It's a shocking contrast. This brutal expansion coinciding with a massive surge in missionary activity.
Driven by that deeply held belief. Unbaptized people were headed for eternal damnation.
The colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, saw themselves as divinely appointed champions of Catholicism, tasked with bringing salvation.
Even to the people they were simultaneously enslaving. Yes, it's a profound contradiction.
And papal bulls played a critical role, like Inter Cetera Divinae, or Manus Pontifex.
Absolutely. They effectively divided the non-European world between Portugal and Spain, granting them authority, temporal and ecclesiastical, over vast territories, even undiscovered ones.
This is where the right of patronage came from. Patronato, real padrodo, giving the crown control over religious affairs in colonies.
Exactly. Colonialism and the duty to Christianize became inextricably linked.
This period also saw the rise of the terms mission and missionary as we know them.
Largely, yes. While the church always spread its message, These specific terms, used significantly by Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits, reflected a more formalized, organized approach to overseas evangelization tied to European expansion.
Before that, it was more like propagation of the faith, preaching the gospel.
Right. The new term suggested a well-established European church dispatching designated people to convert distant populations, a consequence of that expanding worldview.
The church saw itself as a legal entity delegating this mission.
To secular powers and specialized religious orders, yes.
But this patronage system had problems. Civil authorities controlling bishops, papal decrees needing royal approval.
Significant challenges, yes. Civil authorities often exerted considerable control.
So the Pope responded
By establishing the Sacra Congregatio de Propaganda Fide Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in 1622.
to centralize and direct mission efforts from Rome.
Precisely. It marked a crucial shift away from bishops or monasteries initiating missions independently. Now, formal ecclesiastical authorization from Rome was required.
What were the consequences for colonial churches?
They often lacked autonomy, seen as subordinate extensions of Rome missions, daughter churches.
A paternalistic structure, with authority delegated through figures like vicars apostolic reporting to Rome.
That's generally what developed. And interestingly, Propaganda Fide's reach wasn't just overseas. It extended to parts of Europe lost to Protestantism, even Scandinavia, well into the 20th century.
So a missionary situation was defined by the absence of a Catholic hierarchy aligned with Rome.
Basically, yes. If there wasn't that established hierarchy, it was considered mission territory.
Whitty describes this as a dogmatic institutional arrangement, mission as mediating faith and grace through church structures, reproduction and expansion.
A good summary. The presence or absence of that hierarchy became the key indicator.
Now, amidst all this complexity, the church-state issues, coercion, it's crucial to acknowledge the monastic movement's contribution.
Absolutely crucial, and often overlooked. Nieder even suggested monasticism saved the medieval church.
For over 700 years, monasteries were hubs of culture, learning, mission.
Vital hubs, from roughly the 5th to 12th centuries. In a chaotic world, they offered a visible, alternative life centered on God's love and service.
Western monasticism shaped the West as Christian.
Played a foundational role, yes.
Different from Eastern monasticism, which was more solitary, maybe closer to the state.
Generally, yes. Western monasticism, especially shaped by Benedict and Gregory the Great, was more communal, structured, often more independent from secular rulers.
It seems paradoxical, though. A movement focused on renouncing the world becoming a force for missionary expansion.
It does seem that way. But the respect monks earned was critical. After the Age of Martyrs, they became symbols of Christian devotion.
Like the Irish white martyrdom of ascetic life.
Exactly. And their daily lives were a powerful witness. Poverty, hard work transforming the land, prayer. It impacted people, especially rural peasants.
Plus, they were centers of culture, education, preserving learning after barbarian invasions, embodying order.
Their patience, tenacity through invasions, that demonstrated an enduring commitment, too.
So, while not founded as missionary agencies, they were inherently missionary just by existing.
Deeply imbued with a missionary dimension, yes, which eventually led to more direct missionary work.
Like the Irish monks, their peregrinatio pro Christo, wandering for Christ, blending pilgrimage and mission.
A unique contribution, definitely. Spreading learning and faith across Europe.
And then Benedictine monasticism, strong spirituality plus practicality. The rule of St. Benedict, in Omnibus, Glorificetur Deus.
That in all things God may be glorified. Yes. The rule fostered justice, unity, renewal, became a school for the Lord's service.
Quiet, gradual restoration of society over centuries.
And the Benedictines got involved in more explicit mission, too, arguably more than the Celts. Gregory the Great, a Benedictine, sending Augustine to England.
Right. And the interaction, sometimes clash, between Benedictine and Celtic traditions, like in Northumbria, shaped Western Christianity.
Hugely important interaction.
Then we see missionary monks like Boniface, the apostle of Germany.
His calling was personal initially, but he became incredibly influential organizing the church in Germanic lands. Other Anglo-Saxons, too. Willibrord, Permin, Alcuin.
They felt a conviction to serve others through mission. A shift from Celtic personal pilgrimage to Anglo-Saxon mission for others.
And noticeable shift, yes. Peregrinatio for the sake of mission.
Differences in structure, too. Irish abbots had authority. Anglo-Saxons were more tied to the hierarchy.
Generally, yes. Irish monasticism was less centralized. Anglo-Saxon monasticism, especially figures like Boniface, had intense links to bishops, the Pope. They acted as papal emissaries.
aiming to incorporate converts into the universal Catholic Church.
As Rosencrantz summarized it, Celts developed from itinerant preachers to missionaries, Anglo-Saxons from missionaries to church organizers.
But it's important to remember, many monks, Benedictine, Celtic, and later figures like Lull or Las Casas didn't endorse forced conversion.
That's crucial. Las Casas advocated conquista as spiritual conquest through peace and creating protected communities, reducciones.
Okay, so let's try to appraise this whole medieval paradigm. If John 3.16 represents the Greek patristic paradigm, God's love through his Son, maybe Luke 14.23, compel them to come in, is key for the medieval Roman Catholic one.
It often served as a key text, yeah, even if unspoken or contested. Augustine's initial use regarding Donatists set a precedent, later applied, sometimes implicitly, to pagans and Jews.
And this underlying mentality, needing to bring people in, even with pressure, persisted for centuries.
Absolutely. Even in the 16th century, Las Casas was arguing compel meant persuasion, not force. But the conviction behind it, no salvation outside the Catholic Church, remained powerful into the 20th century.
The Church transformed so much during this period. Persecuted minority to dominant institutions.
Ties with Judaism severed.
Intimate, complex church-state relationship.
Formalized dogma.
Shift from apocalyptic movement to expanding Christendom.
Augustine at the start, Aquinas at the climax with his synthesis of natural and supernatural orders.
And this paradigm persisted largely until the 20th century, especially influencing colonialism.
It had remarkable persistence, but our assessment needs nuance.
Right. Newbegin asks, was trying to create a Christian civilization, influence rulers, inherently wrong?
We have to acknowledge the dark side, but also consider potential positives and definitely the historical context after Constantine.
It forces that self-reflection. Would we have acted differently, made better choices in their shoes?
It's impossible to know, but important to ask.
This medieval paradigm, with its institutional focus, sometimes coercion, contrasts with the earlier Greek patristic approach.
And it's crucial to know the Roman Catholic understanding of mission has evolved significantly since Vatican II.
The old saying, Roma semper eadem est, Rome is always the same, doesn't really fit anymore.
Not fully, no. The changes post-Vatican II have been substantial.
Our source suggests Vatican II grappled with integrating multiple historical paradigms.
Which means the current Roman Catholic missionary paradigm is fundamentally different in many ways. A topic for another time, perhaps.
Definitely. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
let's recap the key takeaways. We've explored that distinct Western theology shaped by Augustine.
The intricate, often tricky church-state relationship.
The controversial history of missionary wars and colonialism's entanglement.
And the crucial, maybe underappreciated, role of monasticism in shaping Christian Europe.
Ultimately, understanding this complex history, its achievements and shortcomings, gives us vital context.
Context for Christianity's past and its diverse expressions today.
Absolutely. And on that note, maybe a final thought for you, our listener. Consider the enduring legacy. How do these historical forces, these theological ideas we discussed, still shape our understanding today? Faith, mission, the relationship between cultures, between belief systems.
It's a complex legacy still unfolding.
Worth ongoing reflection, definitely.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.